Thank you, Madam Managing Director. For those of you who didn't catch the reference, no, I won't make Sumaya stand up again. A few weeks ago, the MD gave a speech on, I believe it was at King's College, Cambridge, invoking economic possibilities for the grandchildren as the motivating idea. And I do think that we are very fortunate not just to have her, but to have this opening panel, which we will go right to, on setting the stage and considerations for the future. I'm going to ask the four speakers to come up. We're seating them in alphabetical order by last name. If you don't mind, we'll speed things rather than to give you more time to talk. Our four speakers, starting alphabetically, starts with Gordon Brown, who I had the privilege to do a little work for during the financial crisis. Gordon was Prime Minister of the United Kingdom from 2007 to 2010, Chancellor of the Exchequer in the UK from 1997 to 2007, and spent more than 30 years in Parliament representing his home county of Fife, Scotland. He is the United Nations Special Envoy for Global Education and also is right now leading efforts to deal with child poverty in new and creative ways in the UK and elsewhere around the world. He is also, since September 2021, WHO Ambassador for Global Health Financing. For those of us in the economics profession, it is rare to have someone who's passionate, who understands economics, and still wins elections, and Gordon Brown did that. Won some. But anyway, we're delighted to have former Prime Minister Brown. Supposed to be in the next slot, and I gather is waylaid, on his way, is Sir Angus Deaton. We'll come back to him. In the next slot is Professor Keyu Jin. Keyu is a rising star in international economics. She is currently an associate professor of economics with tenure at the London School of Economics. She recently published the book, The New China Playbook, Beyond Socialism and Capitalism, building on her academic research on China, but bridging it to policy. And she brings an enormously important perspective to this panel from that background, thinking about the structural transformations that China has undertaken willingly and less willingly. I've been fortunate to know her since her career began and marked with great satisfaction her rising influence, and are proud to welcome her to the Peterson Institute. To her left is Michael Spence. Michael is the 2001 Nobel laureate in economic sciences. He spent a distinguished career in academia, not just as an academic, but as Dean of the Faculty of Arts and Sciences at Harvard from 1984 to 1990, and Dean of the Stanford Business School from 1990 to 1999. Beyond his academic work and leadership, I think what's important to note is that he was the intellectual driving force and chairman of the Independent Commission on Growth and Development from 2006 to 2010, which, like think tanks, if you're independent and you don't have money and you still get people to listen to you, you're doing something right. And Mike managed to do that. Interestingly, he and Gordon and Mohammed El-Arian did a book recently called Permacrisis. That doesn't fit under the optimism that the MD was calling for, but nonetheless, it's only the title. I will not, you all have to attest that I did do a proper introduction for Angus. Also joining us is Sir Angus Deaton, who is a Nobel laureate in economics in 2015. He and his co-author and partner, Ann Case, of course, totally changed the public debate and perceptions about inequality in the advanced economies, and particularly the US, with their work on deaths of despair. And he has sent out another, I don't know whether to call it a broadside or a Jeremiad, in his new book, An Economist in America. So with that, Gordon, you can speak from there, or you can come to the podium as you prefer. Great, thank you.
Thank you very much. Can I say, first of all, what a real pleasure it is to be here, to thank Adam and his colleagues for organizing this seminar. and by the way, for serving for 4 years on our Monetary Policy Committee in the United Kingdom with great distinction. And it's a great pleasure to follow Kristalina, who is admired not just in this continent, but in every continent. And I come here as a former finance minister. You know, there's only two kinds of finance ministers, those who fail and those who get out just in time. I suppose I'm now too old to be a European politician, but too young to be an American politician. I want to start with President Kennedy's words 60 years ago. Those who look only to the past or the present are certain to miss out on the future. And I believe that these words come today with a renewed truth and urgency, because I think this seminar, the rethinking of the rethinking, as I understand it, is being held precisely because we do need a new economic paradigm for a world where the three old certainties, the three pillars of the post-Cold War era, and I mean unipolarity, I mean hyperglobalization, I mean neoliberal economics, are all currently crumbling around us. We are seeing three seismic shifts underway in the geopolitics of the world, and indeed facing ever more hazardous and formidable global problems: climate, conflict, pandemic threats, rising poverty and inequality, falling humanitarian aid, global problems that really can only be addressed by globally coordinated solutions, and with much less time than we think to make good on the promise which has eluded us, not just of an inclusive prosperity, but an environmentally sustainable one. The world seems, as my compatriot Winston Churchill once said, leaders seem to be resolved to be irresolute, adamant for drift, solid for fluidity, and all-powerful for impotence. With the result that at the IMF this week, we are seeing reports of global economic growth that would, in the absence of major structural reforms, slip from its historical average of 3.8% a year to 2.8% by 2030, and that makes it the slowest decade for growth in recent times. So drawing for our new paradigm, that I think is what we are really trying to think about, on Angus Deaton's great work, which you'll hear about in a few minutes, about how we must move on, and he's just walking in the door as I mention him. Angus, welcome, and congratulations for being here. I say drawing on Angus's work, showing how we must move on from neoliberal economics, Keyu's important work on the shifts in the center of global economic gravity, Michael's path-breaking work, which I really do want to acknowledge, on how by integrating AI, we can secure a historic boost to productivity and growth. I want to suggest how inch by inch, institution by institution, but mainly issue by issue, we can move our world towards meeting the trinity of objectives: economic growth, social progress, and environmental sustainability, in place of what I see at the moment as slow growth, worsening droughts, floods, farm storms, and famine, and a failure to deliver on humanitarian promises in so many different parts of the world where people are dying in front of TV cameras, and unnecessarily so. Now, when we talk about the first shift I've mentioned, moving from a unipolar to a multipolar world, that's not to mean a multiple of states with equal power. What I mean is simply multiple centers of power. And you've got to ask yourself, would 20 years ago Russia have invaded Ukraine? Would an Israeli prime minister have defied an American president for so long? Would an entire Arab leadership have refused to meet the American president when he was in their region a few months ago? And I think we've got to say that we are moving from that unipolar world and released from what you might call a unipolar straitjacket. There are now countries who feel they can afford to be hedge the bets, be fence sitters, be what some people call swing states. They can be non-aligned or multi-aligned, enter into opportunistic and you might say dangerous liaisons, akin to what some people call limited liability partnerships. And just look at Turkey, for example, working with both Russia and NATO. China, Russia, and Iran are cooperating at the moment. Russia, South Africa, and China have just done joint military exercises. We've got the BRICS, with 20 countries say that they're waiting to join. So where once economics dominated politics, and all the time I was a finance minister, economics was the driving force of political decision-making. Politics is now clearly determining economics, and we have not so much a rules-based order, but a power-based order, and that's the basis on which we've got to start thinking about how we deal with these problems of the future. And the greatest economic risk, as I see, is as we transition from this hyper-globalized world of the last 30 years, we enter not just a more protectionist world, but a neoliberal economics becomes something more akin to a neo-mercantilist economics. Now, we're not dealing with deglobalization. We're not dealing with globalization, in my view, for trade in digital and services is still growing. But we are dealing with a constrained globalization where instead of what we need, which is an open and inclusive globalization that is managed well, not badly, we now have export bans, import bans, technology bans, investment bans, not just tariffs now as the most protectionist of instruments. And the corollary, we have subsidy-based industrial policies, I think 5,000 measures in the advanced economies in recent years, 4,000 in emerging markets, only a fraction of them for competitiveness reasons. And so once trade was seen as the key to standards of living, and now trade restrictions are seen as the key to protecting living standards in many countries. And what we see is not just a return to OPEC's resource nationalism, cutting production to keep prices up, but we've got, you might call, metallic nationalism by Indonesia nationalizing the nickel reserves. You have proximity powers like Mexico using their geographical position to benefit from the China-American standoff. You have companies adopting a China plus 1, 2, 3, or 4 strategy, using connecting countries like Vietnam as middlemen between China and America. But you've got to ask, how long could this be sustained if the China-USA standoff takes us toward a one world, two systems future and forces all these countries to make a choice? So my plea is for us to think of an enlightened self-interest against what is an overzealous trade, industrial policy, and technology nationalism that could easily, particularly if tariffs are imposed from November at 10% from America, morph into trade wars, technology wars, AI wars, capital wars, whatever you call them. And I want to say, in a world where each country's independence is clearly qualified by our interdependence, each of us needs to realize the benefits of a stronger multilateralism, each perhaps for their own reason. India, because it cannot forever play off Russia, America, China, and Europe. The middlemen like Vietnam, who may at some time be forced to make a choice. The Global South needs a multilateral order because it cannot move forward the levels of investment needed on climate or on human capital without some redistribution of resources from the advanced economies. The European Union itself needs a multilateral order because it's currently not just security dependent on America, but also energy dependent on outside countries, trade dependent on China. It needs to sell to the world, and it needs for that an open trading economy, which needs a multilateral umbrella. And beyond that, if I may be so bold to say so in America, while generally America pursued multilateralism in a unipolar era, it cannot succeed for long if it pursues unilateral policies when we're living in a multipolar era, and where it can no longer instruct or dictate, but has got to persuade and convince. So in addition to building alliances, which it's doing at the moment, it should reposition itself, not as the leader of a unipolar order which is fading, but as the leader of a multipolar order, which means working through the very institutions it played a part in creating, and is still the leading power within if it chooses to be. And that raises for me the other problem that is faced by our institutions. They do need to regain credibility as problem solvers. And so, and this is my final point, we need issue by issue to show that we can actually deliver, not some kind of sort of kumbaya cosmopolitanism, but a muscular multilateralism founded on a hard head and cold calculation of strategic interests, where we act together out of necessity. And these would be my starting points. The World Trade Organization should, as both America and China, I think, now realize, move away from the inflexibility of an overly legalistic and broken down judge-based appeal system and use the undoubted skills of Ngozi, its Director General, to solve trade disputes by conciliation, arbitration, and negotiation. The IMF has to prove itself again in its primary task, and that is making itself indispensable as the early warning system for the global economy. Kristalina is well placed in her second term to expand the surveillance role, advising of the risks and opportunities of this new economy. And take both the World Health Organization and the UN humanitarian system. Appeals are only delivering a third of what is needed, and both cannot move forward unless we work towards a burden-sharing system, like we have for UN peacekeeping and indeed IMF and World Bank quotas. So instead of having to pass round a begging bowl, just as yesterday in Paris, every time there is a crisis and an emergency, we create some system at least of predictable financing to deal with global health, education, and humanitarian challenges. And just as the World Health Organization exists because of pandemics where no one is safe till everyone is safe, so we've got to find ways of persuading a skeptical public that you can't address pollution in one country without addressing it in all countries. So we must reinvigorate the World Bank, whose remit has been extended to providing global public goods, including climate activity, at a time when the World Bank's gross disbursements are today just 0.3% of the GDP of the developing world, almost half the 0.55% in 1990. Now, we need the Summers-Singh recommendations to the G20 to be implemented, and given that these are difficult fiscal times for many countries, I would advocate the use of guarantees issued by AAA and AA economies that would help finance the next stage of development. And we have to help Angie Banga square this circle. The World Bank's traditional management practices do not work side by side with the need to de-risk the private sector's contribution to climate change. Finally, we need to think of the G7, far too small, too restricted, too narrowly based to be what America said it wants it to be, the steering committee of the world economy. We need to have Asia, Africa, and Latin America as partners, so we need a revivified G20. It needs a proper secretariat, it needs an agenda year to year, it needs a more representative constituency system, and it needs to play its part in rebuilding economic cooperation, despite all the difficulties with some of its members. So let us be clear about the chilling consequences of us failing. I remember being here chairing an IMFC meeting some years ago when a prominent banner outside in a demonstration that was taking place had this caption, "Worldwide Campaign Against Globalization." And it seemed like an ironic slogan, did it not? But you can see what people meant. For the failure to achieve an inclusive globalization is now giving birth to populist nationalist movements around the world, and look particularly at what's happening in Europe at the moment. It's fueled by the rhetoric of America first, China first, India first, Russia first, Turkey first, and so on. My country first and only. And perhaps worse than that, it's not just seeing the world as a struggle between us and them, but as it sees the world in terms of a zero-sum mentality that takes the view that I can only do well at the expense of my neighbor. And just to give one illustration of the populist pressures that are around the world at the moment, if you look at the European finance ministers group at the moment, I think there's only one that actually was in the job before 2020. All the rest have gone as people employed before then. And so, and of course in the UK, just let me say, we had 4 finance ministers in 3 months, and we had 7 in the last 10 years, a sign of something that may be needing to be changed. Now, I can end, however, with a message of hope, not least because of the vast potential that Michael will talk about, I know, from the work we did together, of the productivity gains through AI and related technologies. In the Tate Gallery in London, one of our most prominent art galleries, there's a painting that Nelson Mandela actually had a facsimile of in his prison cell, and it's entitled Hope. And when you look at the painting, it's of a blindfolded girl trying to play a harp with all its strings broken. And your first instinct is to say, this is not a picture about hope, it's about desolation. But Mandela taught me, and he explained to me, that it is indeed a painting about hope, because its message is that even in the most difficult and the most trying circumstances, even when things seem hopeless, you have to maintain hope. And I think of all the breakthroughs that were achieved in the least propitious of circumstances. The nuclear test ban treaty in the 60s, the Reagan-Gorbachev breakthrough on nuclear weapons in the 80s, the ozone layer agreement in the 1990s, The G20 we had in London in 2009, the Paris Agreement on Climate Change in 2015, when we managed to cooperate our way out of many of the problems that the world faces. And so for me, the conclusion is stark and inescapable. We journey on as we should, not towards some global dead end, but with a plan that all can share in a rising prosperity, and all of us have got a part to make in this journey of hope. Thank you.
No, just the slides are there.
Okay, all right, first of all, my apologies for being late, which I can only All right, my apologies for being late, which I can only put down to old age. Enough of that. I agree with everything that Gordon said, but what I'm going to tell you is why it's going to be so hard. And in fact, I'm very skeptical that it's actually going to happen. So I think I can't read from here. I'm going to have to go down there. Excuse me. Okay. So let me start by saying, what is wrong with what we used to have, the world we had before? And should we go back to it? And my answers are not so much wrong with it, and yes, we should go back to it, if what we mean is old sense liberal democracy with free markets, personal freedom, and especially room for innovation. And these are the things that have made life immeasurably better over the last 300 years. Longer lives, lives less full of pain and misery. We're enormously wealthier than our ancestors. And these gifts have come, most importantly, not to just a few people in a few countries, but to billions of people around the world. That's what that liberal regime has accomplished, admittedly over a long period of time, and with many setbacks. And I start with that because I don't want to be misunderstood with what I'm about to say, and I want all these things to continue. But they're under threat today, and I think we will lose them if we try to go on as before. Let me explain. I want to show you some facts. As before is no longer working. The financial crisis I don't have to talk about here, but I think that broke our world in some very serious way. It revealed capitalism as currently practiced. For many people, they saw that it was a scam that promised material wealth that was never delivered, that trickled down, never trickled down. There's broad concern at the extent of rent seeking by banks, by healthcare, and by big tech. And it's very unclear, in fact, I think it's clear that we have not proved ourselves against such things recurring in the future. I'm going to focus not on money, which I think in some ways, for what I want to say, is misleading, because money is but a means to allow people to do what matters to them. It's not an end. And the ends I'm going to focus on are health in particular. We want to avoid mortality and morbidity. I'm not going to talk about it, but family life is an end, marriage is a life, children, communities are ends. And judged by these ends, the US has not done well by the majority of its people over the last half century. There are growing inequalities in all of these, as well as the more familiar inequalities in wealth and earnings, and I think they're more important. So here's a picture which many of you will have seen. This shows life expectancy at birth in the United States and in 22 other rich countries, which extend from Korea and Japan through to Canada and the OECD and the European countries. And what you can see is that America, US in 1980s was right in the middle of the pack, but has slowly drifted out of that. And it's drifted pretty steadily out of that, even before the pandemic. And then, of course, there was the dip during the pandemic. I updated this the other day to bring in 2022. One of the outrages in America is we don't get these data until 2 years after the fact. And this, I made this now 25 rich countries, but you can see the picture is very much the same. We had a terrible COVID experience. Other people had COVID experiences too, but nothing quite as bad as what we saw. This is worse in the US by a long way, but it's not absent elsewhere. Partly because outside the US, the same forces come up against better protection against pharma, better regulation, better social protection, but there's still these deep underlying forces of deindustrialization which are working on a lot of rich countries. They're not being fully addressed. I also, given that Gordon's here, and he said nice things about me, I think he did. I sort of missed that part. Okay.
Always.
If you take the UK out of the picture I showed you and put England and Wales and Scotland in separately, you get this picture in which Scotland, which has always been the sick man or the sick woman or whatever, but was tracking parallel, at least until the last few years. And now Scotland looks a lot like the US. The mortality rate from drugs in Scotland is comparable to the mortality rate from drugs in the United States. So we're not alone. It's not much comfort, but there we are. Now, what I really want to make the point here is that if you split these, and the death certificates tell you, and this is the work that Ann Case and I have been doing and extending, and this was just extended the other day. Currently, 38% of the adult population in in the United States, have a 4-year college degree. They have a bachelor's degree. 62%. So keep these in mind. This is not a minority we're talking about here. This is 2/3 of the population versus 1/3 of the population. So the 38% of the adult population that has a 4-year college degree, its life expectancy at 25, you can't do this at birth because you don't know whether people are going to go to college yet. But the life expectancy at 25 has grown all the way up to the pandemic. If you are unfortunate enough not to have a 4-year college degree, that stopped around 2010. And there's been it's actually worse for women than for men, but life expectancy just ceased growing, while the minority, were doing okay. You can also see what happened during the pandemic. Much, much worse outcomes, presumably largely tied to occupation, but perhaps not exclusively, than for people with a 4-year college degree. The gaps there are extraordinary. This is not a very long period in demographic history. This is 30 years. The gap is a little over 2 at the beginning, and it's over 8 now in a period of 30 years. We've got 2 worlds here, and one of these worlds is not doing very well. I talked about marriage, family, out-of-wedlock childbearing, parents knowing their kids. All of that is disintegrating. Pain, huge increases in pain, huge increases in suicide, all among people without a 4-year degree. There's something really, really bad going on here. If you plot that against the 25-year adult life expectancy for the same 25 countries, you can see that we look like Japan or Switzerland among the best performers. We, advisedly, being everybody in this room, at least those of you who are Americans. But look at the other one. I mean, that's not anything that we should be able to countenance. This is just a disaster. So, why? There are parallels next to it, which I will show you on the next slide. But even if there were no parallels elsewhere, and this is something that Gordon said and is very, very important, we've lived in a world in which economics was driving politics, We're now in a world in which politics is driving economics, and no matter why, given the numbers I've just shown you. And other places should and do worry about the geopolitical effects of what is happening in the US, even if they were insulated from all this, which they're not. And the less educated majority has reason to be angry. The suffering and loss of power. Unions barely exist in the private sector, about 6%. They're massively outspent. Ken Galbraith wrote about the unions as countervailing power to corporate interests. That's gone, it's not there anymore. 99% of the Senate, i.e. all but one of them, and 94% of the House have 4-year bachelor's degrees. Indeed, half of them have graduate degrees, mostly JDs. The wage premium for college, you know, when I first came to US, we all learned that was 40%. It's now 80%. So that huge gap in earnings. Income's less because so many more women are taking 2 and 3 jobs to make the budget go somewhere. There's, as a result, rejections of institutions that are dominated by educated people. Congress, the universities, the legal system, the CDC, science itself. I don't know how many of you saw the article in the New York Times this morning about the Education Committee in the House, which is grilling Manouk Shafiq this afternoon. And the story of Virginia Fox, who's the chairman of that committee, who hates the Ivy League with a deep passion, which is shared by many of her constituents and many other people in America. They are reciprocating the experienced condescension. And they're threatening not just liberal democracy in the US, but global stability. And international relations are now being shaped by this American discontent. And I think this is the threat of inequality to democracy. It's not a threat of income inequality or wealth inequality. It's the widening gap in leading successful lives and flourishing between those with and without a college degree. Running a country by and for an educated minority, excluding the rest of the population, focusing on global universal values, which I share, and neglecting local values. We owe things to our fellow citizens. Democracy is not working for the majority, and that can bring us all down. The future needs less polarization and more genuine sharing of power. I would argue that this global educated elite, successful and much of it wealthy, that is composed of subsets of domestic elites, but you can see it in London, the east and west coast of the US, British public schools, which are now 40% foreign, American universities, elites in India and China, excluding most of the domestic population, which in many cases has also suffered from deindustrialization, loss of community, social capital, political power, and what John Rawls called the social bases of self-respect, which in the US takes us back to the health outcomes with which I began, but the populism in other countries shares many of the same features. We need to share power, refocus towards domestic, away from global, or we will have it done to us. We have to recognize that we're largely at fault here. Thank you.
Thank you, Adam, Maury Pure-Olivier, for inviting me. Gordon touched upon this tidal wave of geopolitics, and in particular mentioned US-China. Being here in DC, sometimes I wonder whether there is really such an existential crisis between the two countries, given that they're looking more and more alike, with China copying US technology and the US model looking more and more like the China model, which is something I'll come back to. Now, conventional views about structural change often surround an economy's transition from agriculture to industry, from low to high productivity sectors and towards a more sustainable model of growth. But structural transformation is likely to take on, in my view, a whole new level of meaning in the context of what some would consider a technological revolution currently unfolding, where machines become conscious, where biotech and information technologies are likely to change what it means to be alive. So it would be remiss, I think, to not discuss about structural change in the context of a rising crop of new technologies that are intelligent, green, super connected, ubiquitous, and redefining new economic structures and international relations. Industry 4.0 is founded on the triangle of data, new age communication, artificial intelligence. Now, for advanced economies that want to maintain and reinforce its high position in the value chain, or for developing countries that aspire to climb up the value chain, mastering these new emerging strategic technologies now appear to be critical. Now, this has implications for the role of the state, for the eventual role of developing countries that cannot manufacture their way out of poverty, and the requisite skills for a broader set of labor force that has to adapt to this new reality. And of course, the contours of international competition around technology, for which I think we have thought much less about and know much less about than international trade. And much of the rising tension is really over technology, not trade, in the guise of trade wars and reduced investments. Now, the first reason why we might be seeing this renewed focus, even obsession around high tech, is that some of it involves general purpose technologies, technologies that shape the future and permeate throughout the entire economy, all kinds of sectors. Of course, AI has the potential to revolutionize medicine, ecology, education, science, and discovery. And China has figured out that unless you master the upstream segment of the innovation network, one has neither national nor economic security. And also, many of these emerging strategic sectors don't have powerful incumbents with prior advantage, given the and this gives the newly rising countries a possibility not only to catch up, but actually to leapfrog. And of course, on top of that, there's rising demand for these kind of goods, new technologies. And so to some ambitious countries like China, they are up for grabs in this new race. Now, the second observation is that increasingly these technologies are more and more dual use. Some estimates suggest that only whereas about 10% of these technologies were dual use in the late 1970s, the number now is 75 to 80%. This has important implications, but also complications for trade, technological diffusion, where economic drivers are sometimes inextricably linked with security concerns. Now, for all of these reasons, we're seeing a return of the state. More and more targeted government intervention to actively change the sectoral structure of production and steer it towards certain sectors, or even creating national champions. This is not true not only of the US in the forms of CHIPS Act, Science Act, Inflation Reduction Act. Japan is spending hundreds of billions of dollars on indigenous innovation. European industrial policies for digital innovations such as chips, batteries, climate adaptation. Of course, China has the mega projects, strategic emerging innovation, and state guidance funds that amounts to at least hundreds of billions of dollars, if not more. The race to dominate strategic emerging sectors, strive for independence or reduce reliance is part of a new trend that seems now somewhat inevitable. But even so, it needs to be managed. Now, we're going to have an expert panel on industrial policy, of course, is a very important component of it. It's hard to deny from China's point of view that some of them could be pretty successful. If you look at solar, since 2005, China basically led the solar boom. Every year, an annual production increase of 76%. In 2005, it was a desert of zero innovative capacity. By 2015, something like 10,000 new patent applications every year, really at the frontier of the technology frontier. And because it was implemented at the city level, local level, at different times across different geographies, you can really trace the impact. And the cities that had these industrial policies for solar saw a 50% increase in innovative capacities over time. And this is certainly true of EV, again, mentioning the strategic emerging sector. China can do combustion engine cars, spending tons of money on it, but within 10 years became the largest producer and consumer of EVs, and including innovation. So another reason why state capacity, state coordination might be more needed in this new age of technology is that it's going to require colossal investment in new types of infrastructure, like data processing centers, supercomputing networks, 5G base stations, EV charging stations. In China's experience, actually these EV policies in the early phases were not successful until the infrastructure was put in place. And now China has 4 million EV charging stations. I think in this country, something like 160,000. China's adding 250,000 of EV charging stations every year. So that obviously has implications for fiscal pressure, rising debt issues, and so forth. So what does this leave for developing countries who don't even have sufficient traditional infrastructure in place? And I think it's a real issue that their comparative advantage based on costs may be gradually eroded as sophisticated robotics, smart networks, digitization of manufacturing will allow advanced economies to hold on to their advantage in traditional industries. Now, of course, in the case of China, it's seeing rising wages, but it's investing heavily in digital and smart manufacturing to hold on to that advantage. And so in this new age, structural transformation is probably also tantamount to reshoring and reindustrialization around the world. Fourth, this comes to another aspect of structural transformation, I think, that is the education and skill mismatch that is probably as urgent as the demography issue. Again, in a place like China, high youth unemployment, it doesn't really matter that there was 100 million additional college graduates in the last 10, 15 years. There's still very high youth unemployment, but 25 million vacant jobs in manufacturing, 300,000 talent gap in semiconductors. It's that mismatch between skill and education that has led to some of this rising unemployment for the youth. And so what does it mean for the government to upskill and retool the labor force? Lastly, this is happening against the tidal wave of geopolitics and geoeconomics. Longer, more expensive trade routes, greater uncertainties that reduce investment, including clean energy, has the potential to do a lot of damage, unless more transparent and clear system of norms, values, and rules are in place around not only technology, but data flows to harness the productivity gains there, and some new ideas about how to keep that innovation in this greater intensified competition and bringing along with that more benefits for consumers. At the same time, preventing predatory behavior and tactics that are more focused on limiting others rather than strengthening oneself. And so there are more questions raised than suggestions provided, but I see, given the depth and breadth of this agenda, many of these answers, I'm sure, will be answered in due course. Now, finally, to answer to Madam MD's ask of instilling more optimism, I'm not sure I've given a particularly optimistic view, but it might be appropriate to paraphrase a somewhat dark Italian communist writer, Gramsci, that it might be the pessimism of the intellect, but optimism of the will. Thank you.
Okay. Can you hear me? Well, I'm delighted to be the cleanup batter here. I want to thank Adam and Maury and Olivier and all the team that organized this. And it's particularly gratifying as you get older to come and have a chance to visit. I live in Italy, so visit with old, well, maybe longtime friends and colleagues. And I think this is a really interesting and important time. So I'm looking forward to listening to the subsequent discussion. as Adam mentioned, if I spent some time with a group of other people thinking about growth in developing countries, and when a country's growing on a sustained basis, or like a quarter of a century at 7%, it's pretty hard to miss the structural change because it's happening so quickly. And so in the world of development, structural change is such an important ingredient in the recipe that a lot of time gets spent on it. Justin Lin has an important institution in Beijing that deals with what he calls the new structural economics, and has many academic and other colleagues who think about this. In the developed economies, the high-income economies, the attention to structural change, I think, is considerably more episodic. And we go through periods where it doesn't seem to matter much. If we're in a demand-constrained growth pattern, I didn't find too many people, too upset about the disastrously declining productivity trend. But when you shift to a world that's a little bit, looks more like ours, where the supply side's struggling to keep up with the demand side, it tends to get your attention. So when Gordon and Mohammed and I wrote this book, I thought a lot about how to try to bring some of the things that are going on into focus. And what I came to, and this is just one perspective, is I think of the world we're living in right now as a kind of big, loud collision of three sets of powerful forces. And they've been referred to. One is a set of shocks coming from multiple sources: pandemics, financial, climate change. They're more frequent, they're more severe, they're macroeconomically significant, and they are affecting behavior at all levels: policy, business, investment, etc. And so that's one set. The second is a set of secular trends that are important. I mentioned one, the declining productivity trend, but we also have aging. I checked just when we were writing the book. The countries that are dramatically aging account for close to 80% of the global economy, measured by GDP. So it's true, that's only a third of the global population, and it may be true that sometime down the road, all those young countries are going to be an important driving force, but at barely 20%, that's not going to be true, at least for the next decade. But there are others, big changes in labor market behavior, rising sovereign debt levels in a rising interest rate environment, that kind of thing. The third set, and the ones that I'm going to spend most of my time on, are at least three huge scientific and technological transformations that are underway. And you know what they are. There's a multi-decade digital one that's just been turbocharged by huge advances in the last decade in artificial intelligence. The second one is only slightly less visible revolution in biomedical and life sciences that will transform many things, and it will collide with the digital one in the near future. And the third is this massive energy transition that we have to go through in order to achieve sustainability. And all three of those things are driving really quite large structural change. And the way I think of it is it's on a scale and pace that's quite bewildering and hard to deal with. So I asked Mistral AI, which is France's entry into the large language models and Gen AI world, whether this was a world of very rapid accelerating structural change. And it said yes. And not only did it say yes, but it just said a little bit like what I just told you, so I won't repeat it now. But for anybody who's interested, I have a screenshot of the answer. So what are these changes, structural changes that are being driven that we're seeing? One is a pattern of diversification in global supply networks that we just didn't see before. We lived for 30 or 40 years in a world when global supply chains and networks were constructed almost entirely on efficiency and comparative advantage considerations. You can modify that. The Cold War was a significant override of that, but for the most part, that's how they were built. They weren't very resilient, they weren't very, shock-proof, and so on. That's completely changed. And that is being driven both by private sector behavior, incentives, in pursuit of resilience, but then, strongly reinforced by economic policies in pursuit of national security, its sidekick, economic security and the inability to be extorted, etc. And this is a process that has reduced the supply elasticity of the global supply system and increased its costs. I mean, in Europe, as Olivier knows, we're in a high-speed diversification away from dependence. It's just one example on Russian fossil fuels, and it's a significant factor in the growth challenges that we face. Examples, 15% of Apple's advanced iPhone assembly is now in India. That's set to expand. If you go it's hard to describe this in summary form, but if you go to micro level and start looking around, you'll discover this pattern virtually everywhere. And that's, I don't think, reversible. It's an example of what my colleagues have already talked about, dual-use technologies, the override of the national security considerations, the driving of politics with a kind of nationalist focus, reinforcing it. If you look at the Chips and Science Act in the United States, it has three parts. One part's pretty hard to criticize. It's, staying at the forefront of these technologies and so on, especially semiconductors. The second part is the national security argument. We're bringing home part of it to the United States because we need to know how to make these things. The general public doesn't distinguish between designing and making semiconductor chips. So designing them we got a lot of companies that do that well. NVIDIA, ARM in the UK, etc. But making them at the 3 nanometer level is only done in 2 places in the world: South Korea by Samsung and Taiwan by TSMC. And that's viewed as just way too risky in a world that could turn against you. So we're not bringing all of that back home. What we are bringing back home is enough of it so if we have to scale it up later, we can. And that's you'll see that over and over again. Now let me turn to the kind of digital side of things. In some sense, structural change as a result of digital technology is not new. Our colleagues at MIT documented a pattern of fairly rapid, elimination of routine jobs and this is non-AI, standard coding, routine, machines can do the job kind of work. And that was a pretty big effect. It led or contributed to job and income polarization in the United States economy and many other advanced economies. But I have to say that the breakthroughs in artificial intelligence, neural network-based artificial intelligence feels different to me in terms of sheer power. And so I'll spend the remaining minutes of my time on that. First of all, what are these breakthroughs? Well, we had language recognition, speech recognition, writing recognition, then a huge breakthrough in image or object recognition that occurred around 2015 or 2016. That was the moment in which all the competitors to the neural network-based machine learning model essentially gave up, threw in the towel, and switched. And if AIs are essentially almost always benchmarked against human performance, that's natural. That's what Alan Turing wanted us to do. It's dangerous because it leads to an automation bias. The bias comes from, well, the machine just beat the human. Why don't we get rid of the human? So we got to worry about that. But most of these technologies are now passing average human performance. And then we have the Gen AI models. So the Gen AI models, I think, I'll just state it broadly. I'm not alone in this. James Monique and I wrote a paper that essentially said, if we realize the full potential of these things, we could get an enormous sustained surge in productivity. And the reasons are several. One, this is the first technology that has a domain switching capability. All previous technologies were designed to do a specific thing. But think of it as a large language model. They've read everything. The gating factor, by the way, is computing power. It's not data. They just read the internet. What domain switching means is that you don't have to tell it what the task is. You can talk to it about the Italian Renaissance or inflation or do a math problem or computer coding, And you don't have to tell it, just knows what you're doing and engages. Second, this is a human-like capability that people thought AIs couldn't have. Second, accessibility. You don't need technical training to use it. You can just talk to it. Maybe a little bit in terms of prompts. And third, it's read everything. Now, this hasn't been well thought through, but I've been listening to Jeff Hinton. So the way Jeff Hinton explains this is that what these things do is they read everything and then curate the content for a specific function. So Eric Brynjolfsson and his colleagues did a study of the application of this for basically customer service applications. They trained the model. By the way, these are personal assistants. This is not automation. They trained it on thousands and thousands of audio recordings of customer service, customer interactions. The model kind of figured out, how you should do this. And then they gave it in a controlled way, along with performance indicators, to half the agents. And there were two results. There was an instantaneous productivity increase of 14% overall. But the most interesting result, from the point of view of understanding what it really does, is the productivity effect on the least experienced agents was 36%. Why? Because it delivered the content of all this experience back in a usable form much faster than you can acquire it sort of on your own. Jeff Hinton explains, Jeff's the godfather of modern AI, he explains this in the following way. He says, a really good experienced doctor will essentially have an internal database of several thousand patients. An AI properly trained will have several hundred thousand. And it will detect patterns that human beings can't detect. And finally, this interests me because of the blue-collar world. Robotics is severely limited in the unstructured part of the world, outside of manufacturing facilities or, fulfillment centers. But a human-robotic interaction is now made possible if the robot is, essentially enabled by Gen AI. And you can see this on the internet if you go look. There's an OpenAI enabled robot talking to somebody. It's quite stunning. Now, if you're really interested in this, the latency is really interesting. So if you need high-speed responses, you ain't going to get it because the Gen AI is sort of cranking away and it takes about 5 seconds to figure out what's going on. But anyway, this is where we're going. I think this, when you add all this up, you've got the potential. So the other thing I want to say, and I'll close with this, is, so what do we need to do? We've been handed these incredibly powerful tools. What do we need to do to realize this potential? One, we have to avoid the automation bias, right? This instinct to, this is, and it causes fear, anxiety, resistance, etc. Second, this technology, like previous rounds of digital technology, will not spread evenly and accessibly through the entire economy. It'll be in the tech sector and finance first. There'll be lagging sectors. The small and medium-sized businesses won't know what to do with it. There really is a very important role, and there's nothing new in this in economic history. I hope we see this in the next session, that we need the government to have this as part. The third thing is, my view, and I think James shares this, is there's lots of bad uses of this technology, and there's nothing wrong with a policy agenda that has a big component that's focused on risks and misuse. But if that's the whole policy agenda and the positive part isn't there, then we're going to miss a major opportunity that has both growth and productivity potential in it, but also inclusiveness or, inequality reducing characteristics. Bottom line, I hope that's a note of optimism, Adam, and so I will stop there. Thank you.
Thank you all. Thank you, Gordon. Thank you, Angus. Thank you, Keyu. Thank you, Mike. We are going to move directly into the next panel, which is chaired by Maury Obstfeld. We have the stage set. We have the grounds for optimism, even if we're not quite to optimism yet, but we also have the challenges. And so between now and roughly 24 hours from now, it will all be solved. And so that starts with Maury. And again, Thank you all very much. In theory, we have a 5-minute break. Try not to abuse it.